Vox.com is gross, if you were to ask me, because they're rejecting the choice of a non-trans individual to be called whatever they want. Now, I'll get to that. But the crux of this story, why Republicans are suddenly in a rush to regulate every trans kid's puberty. Vox reports proposals in 8 states would ban puberty blockers and hormones for trans minors. There's one simple reason, and I'll just tell you, and we'll ignore what Vox... No, we won't ignore what Vox has to say. We'll read what they have to say. But it's simple. Desistance rates. The rate at which trans kids reject the trans identity and revert back to their biological gender identity is between 64 and like 95%, or 65 to 94%, depending on your studies. Now, a lot of people are claiming those studies are not legitimate, and they say that desistance is actually like 0.3%. Well, hold on. I'm going to be fair. Detransition is actually very, very, very low in adults who transition, but among kids, it is very, very, very high. Now, the main reason I said Vox is gross is that you may remember the story of James Younger. This was a big controversy, I believe it was in Texas, where the mother claimed the child was trans and the father claimed the child wasn't. So who do you trust? A court battle ensued, and joint conservatorship was granted between both parents. And according to the father, James chooses to be James. I'm not going to argue, because you've got one side saying the mother is protecting the child and the doctor said so. The father is saying it's essentially, let me make sure I get this right. I don't think the father is calling this, but Munchausen syndrome by proxy. We'll read this. But basically, why, which parent am I supposed to trust? I don't know, because the father says the child chooses to be James and the mother is lying to him. And the mother says, no, he's been diagnosed this way. And James is actually a transgender girl named Luna. None of that matters. At the end of this court case, James Younger is now officially James Younger, period. Any puberty blockers or treatment will have to be confirmed by both parents or I believe a third party. But in the end, a photo emerges of 7-year-old James and the father says, see, James is there smiling, choosing to be James. If that's the case, I'm not going to pretend there is evidence against the father or the mother to prove either is right. You can argue the father is biased, that's what the left will say. The father is just a bigot. He doesn't want to accept his daughter's true identity. I have no evidence of that. I have no evidence of the mother being right or wrong or the father being right or wrong, except for a picture of a young child, a male, smiling. In which case, okay, James is James. Vox will not extend that. Vox only chooses to affirm the identity of individuals who agree with them. That's why I say Vox is gross. But let's read this story. I'll get to the point. But I do want to stress one more time. When you get a story about someone who says they're trans and their name is Luna, Vox says, then that's their name. But if not, now if you get a story saying, nope, James didn't want to be called Luna, he wants to be called James, they say, no, it's still Luna. You won't accept the identity of the child unless they agree with your ideology. That literally makes no sense. And I got to say this, it adds to the argument as to why puberty blockers should be banned. I'm not saying they should be banned. I'm saying it adds to that argument. Now, one of the big issues here with the puberty blockers is that it's for in a lot of cases under the age of 18. That I don't agree with, because desistance rates in post-puberty individuals is much lower. It's my understanding. Look, if you got someone who's 17 years old and is trans and diagnosed, I think it makes no sense to not offer them what they want. But I do think it makes sense because puberty blockers don't make sense for someone who's after puberty, right? But let's read this and get to the gist of it, and we'll talk about what's going on. Vox reports. I'm not going to read that first paragraph. They say before his transition, Grayson was on antidepressants. Grayson's a biological female, just to deal with his dysphoria. Rodriguez said, if I had known what was making my daughter at the time so unhappy, I would have done it at 3, which is just a social transition, she said, referring to respecting transgender kids' chosen names, pronouns, and styles of dress without any medical interventions before kids' puberty. Deciding whether to allow a trans adolescent to go on puberty blockers is a decision most parents don't take lightly. They often talk to doctors and psychologists, and the general guidelines of most major American medical associations recommend affirming a child's gender exploration in order to improve their mental health. Transitioning is a slow, deliberative process for minors, and only adolescents who are insistent, persistent, and consistent in their gender identity over long periods are recommended for medical intervention. However, some conservative politicians want to take the decision out of the hands of doctors and parents who know these teens best and put it in the hands of the state. In fact, in Grayson's home state of Texas, lawmakers have promised to introduce legislation that would essentially ban, midway, his medical transitioning once their next legislative session begins in 2021. They say there's 8 states, Missouri, Florida, Illinois, Oklahoma, Colorado, South Carolina, Kentucky, and South Dakota, have already introduced bills this year that would criminally punish doctors who follow best practices for treating adolescents with gender dysphoria. In South Dakota, for example, doctors who prescribe puberty blockers or cross-sex hormones could face a $2,000 fine and a year in prison under the proposed law. South Dakota's version of the bill was even prioritized and became the first bill of the decade to pass out of committee. On Wednesday, it passed in the House in a 46-23 vote. Now, I'm going to stop here. I defer to doctors, man. I really, really do. Now, there's concern about a lack of research. And let me tell you one of the most important issues in this debate. Online, you are not allowed to criticize this stuff. You're not. I could get banned for simply saying this, and I know I'm treading on thin ice, walking the razor's edge whenever I do videos about this stuff. It is actually against the rules to target this marginalized community. What ends up happening then is that stories about the negative results of transition never seem to make the light of day. You end up with almost every story being positive, but no one really tells the stories that are negative because everyone wants to pretend that it's the right thing all the time. It certainly isn't. But again, in this instance, I do think it's important to defer to doctors who actually research this, and I do think it's a bit absurd that you would have the government step in to determine whether or not a doctor should or shouldn't be allowed to prescribe a treatment. That to me doesn't make sense. I do think it's fair to point out the principal argument, one of the strongest from conservatives, is that the majority, the overwhelming majority, in some instances 94% or so of prepubescent transgender individuals, trans kids, they desist. They end up going back to their biological gender. There's a big challenge in what the government should or shouldn't be allowed to do, and a question arising over who you trust, the doctors or the government. I don't know. Listen, doctors aren't always right. Surprise, surprise. That we used to, people 100 years ago would drink mercury. Well, they wouldn't drink mercury, but they would 200 years ago, they would rub mercury ointments on their skin to cure certain diseases. Yeah, we don't do that anymore. Not a good idea. But at the time, there was no other cure. So that was the best they could do. I think it's funny when people look back at the founding fathers and like, why am I going to trust a group of people who rubbed mercury all over their skin and died from it? Because there were literally no other cures. So it was the best they had. It may be that we look back on this time and talk about how insane it was that we would do radiation therapy for cancer when all you had to do was get the cure. We don't have a cure right now. And so we do the best we can. That's what I see when I look to a lot of these trans issues. It's like, is it the perfect solution? Probably not, but I don't know it is. And all I can really do is defer to the science. But here's the thing. On both sides, right, you have interesting arguments. But I'm concerned about the ideological pressure from the left to get rid of science, to remove the negative stories, and to refuse to affirm the identity of people who reject their ideology. In that instance, I would probably side more so with the conservatives on maybe we should slow down until we can figure out what's really going on here. Not that I want to punish anybody, not that I think I know better, but I'm concerned about the ideology. When I see stories about research on rapid onset gender dysphoria being removed due to activist outrage, I say these activists should not have a bearing on whether or not we're going to publish research, even if that research isn't very strong. We should let the scientific community do its thing. Same is true for climate change. So now we're in an interesting position. But let me just jump ahead. Let me jump ahead because I want to show you what really bothers me and makes me distrust the people advocating for or against these laws. Now, look, I'm fairly ambivalent. I'm the milquetoast fence sitter, and these are tough issues. But if you want to convince me, the independent voter, the moderate voter, to side with you, I'm definitely listening. But when you refuse to affirm the identity of somebody, why would I believe you actually care about affirming someone's identity? You see, let me read this for you. Vox writes, the recent conservative push for an outright ban on transition care for minors grew directly from the social media disinformation campaign surrounding Luna Younger. Really? A 7-year-old trans girl from Dallas caught in the middle of a bitter custody battle. This article from Vox was published on the 29th, yesterday. That's really interesting because the latest news on James Younger is the mother lost her appeal. And as far as any one of us know, James identifies as a boy named James. Why would Vox not use the affirmed identity and gender expression of the individual? Why would they assume the father is lying? Why would they reject legitimate reporting from the New York Post showing a picture of a little boy wearing a button-up shirt? Let me tell you something. If Vox is going to try and come out and say it's the father who's forcing this child, what's the difference between that and saying the mother is forcing the child? Well, they'll argue, well, what about the doctors, prescribing this? The kid is 7 years old, okay? Let me show you this. Munchausen syndrome by proxy. They basically say the caregiver with Munchausen syndrome by proxy will lie about child symptoms, change test results to make the child appear ill, and physically harm the child to produce symptoms. I am not going to argue the mother is doing that either. I'll actually say it's a really good argument to point out that James Younger was diagnosed, there is a doctor involved, and they're exploring what to do. The problem is, if a photo pops up showing the kid saying, smiling, who am I supposed to believe? Maybe the kid just doesn't know enough. There's another big problem with the transgender child issue is that kids are impressionable, and that's why desistance is so high. And that's why it probably makes sense not to alter their bodies with life-changing hormones and chemicals until they're a little bit older. I'm not making it up. I'm not trying to be biased. I will show you. Look at this. They say, this is a Wikipedia aggregate, so take it for what it is. It is estimated that the number of detransitioners in 2014 ranged from less than 1% to as many as 5%. A 2018 survey of WPATH surgeons found that approximately 0.3% of patients who underwent transition surgery later requested detransitional surgical care. The 2015 U.S. transgender survey found 8% of respondents who had transitioned reported having ever detransitioned, and 62% of that group had later returned to living in a transgender role. So it's a very small percent. However, they say desistance in gender dysphoric adolescents may be higher. A 2008 study found 61% desisted from their trans identity before reaching the age of 29. And a 2013 study found 63 desisted before 20. A 2019 clinical assessment found that 9.4% of patients with adolescent emerging gender dysphoria ceased wishing to pursue medical interventions and or no longer felt their identity was incongruent with their biological sex within an 18-month period. So many of them within a year desisted, and 61 to 63 by the time they were either 20 or 29 desisted. Some studies go even further, but I'm just pulling up what we have here. And I think it's fair to point out people who transition later in life are less likely to transition back. That brings me back to the issue of James Younger. You've got two sides in this. You've got the left and the right. You've got the right saying the mother's lying, the left saying the father's lying. I don't care. Here's a picture of a kid wearing a shirt. Fine. He says he's James. As far as I know, I'm not going to accuse either parent of lying. Why then would Vox refuse? They keep referring to James as Luna, even though there's a photo of James wearing boys' clothes. They say 7-year-old trans girl from Dallas, Luna Younger, caught in the middle of a bitter custody battle between parents who disagree over her gender identity. Her. Okay. A Texas judge overruled the jury decision to award full custody of Luna to her mother, Anna Georgelis, in late September. That means Luna's father, Jeffrey Younger, who insists on dressing his child as a boy and forced her to cut her hair, has an equal say in the future medical decisions for Luna. Therein lies the big problem, the bias. Vox refuses to accept the mother could be lying. I don't know who is. I certainly don't. But I can tell you this. The way Vox is framing this, they're making it seem like it's the father who's the bad guy when you have no evidence to suggest otherwise, and a court ruled for joint custody, which means we just don't know. Let the child live as a child and do the childlike things. But if desistance is as high as it is, it probably doesn't make sense to keep calling this kid by a name that may or may not reflect who the kid really is. They say this. Driving the conversation about the case were primarily conservative media outlets. In the week following the initial jury decision, 23 conservative news sites published 55 stories about Younger, and all opposed the child's transition. According to data from Media Matters, let me just interject, a site that just lies all the time. They say those 55 stories earned 3.5 million Facebook interactions. Let me stop right there. That's sure. I will absolutely accept those numbers. Can we write about all of the leftist sites that are pushing the inverse narrative? What is an average person supposed to think? Let me just stop right now. I don't care what Vox thinks. I don't care what the Daily Wire thinks. I think it's important if the doctors are making a diagnosis that we trust our doctors to the best of our abilities. I think it's fine if you look to the data, which says resistance is very, very high, the majority, sometimes the major majority, and decide for your child what the best course of treatment is. In the end, if you had a child who did have some kind of illness, let's try and do a different analogy. And the parents were arguing over what the treatment should be because one could result in debilitating side effects over their life. And it's also possible the disease, could clear up on its own. I don't know what to tell you, man. I don't know what the right answer will be. It's two parents arguing over the right way to raise their child. And guess what the court said? Joint custody, because there is no clear answer. So Vox is trying to play the game that, everybody basically plays, where they point the finger at the other side and say, but not me. Sorry. In the end, there's a lot of things the court probably heard that we don't know. We don't know all the evidence. But if they're saying joint conservatorship and they know that will result in the child being James and a photo emerges of James as James, why assume otherwise? The court ruling basically said both parents have to agree to treatment. If the father won't, they won't do the treatment. They're erring on the side of not having James transition. I have no issues with anybody. I don't care if you're, a furry, if you're a trans species or transracial. Hey, man, I'm all about liberty. You do your thing. The challenge here is we're talking about kids, and we're talking about which parent can decide the medical treatment. Vox is outraged that people would oppose this. Sorry, you don't actually have a leg to stand on when you are too biased to see what's actually going on. All I can say is trust the courts, and that's what they've ruled. Now, if it comes down to the fact that these things get banned, the puberty blockers, I have said I think it's kind of stupid if the government would restrict certain things if a doctor thinks it's medically necessary. But in the end, that's how our system of government works. And perhaps I can point out, doctors used to recommend lobotomies and electrotherapy. We don't do those things anymore either. Now, you could argue that this research in puberty blockers is new. Yes, and lobotomies were new at 1.2, and electroshock therapy were new at 1.2. Okay? I'm not saying that what they're offering is wrong. I'm saying we can't just assume doctors will always be correct. We can't assume all of the treatments we prescribe will always be correct. We can only defer to the best of our knowledge to the experts. Guess what? That means I personally will be more likely to agree with doctors on this one, knowing they have been wrong in the past. Now, I know a bunch of people are going to get mad and say, how dare you compare these things like electroshock therapy to transgender treatments. Yeah, I'm sorry. They're just medical treatments. I'm not saying they're the same. I'm not saying transgender, treatment and surgery is the exact same thing. I'm saying we never know what will change in the future. And you will end up with laws saying, guess what? You can't lobotomize people anymore. Does that mean transgender surgery is the same thing? No, it doesn't. I'm just making an analogy to something that has been banned in the past. The government is now trying to ban these treatments. In 20 or 30 years, we'll see what happens, and people won't think twice. It just won't be a thing. But my real problem here is what's making me mistrust the left and the doctors is how the media is pushing a narrative and refusing to accept the results of the courts and of the child's own identity. If the kid says they're James in a photo, you can't assume conspiracy. I'm sorry. There's no evidence to suggest that the father forced the kid to do this if the kid's just smiling in a photograph. In that case, the best thing we can do is say, as far as I know, this kid's identity is James. Why would Vox reject that identity? Why would Vox say, I'm not? No, it's the father. It's very strange. They're willing to accept a trans identity, but not the kid's birth identity because it's about ideology. And in that case, I don't trust you because I don't think you actually care about the well-being of the child. I don't think you care about whether or not the treatments will be safe and effective. I think you care about winning for your ideology. But I'll leave it there. I don't want to make this one super long. I'll do you this. I originally started exploring this story because of this story about Elizabeth Warren. She wants a transgender child to pick her Secretary of Education, saying the child would interview the person on her behalf and let her know if the person would be correct. It literally makes no sense. And again, it's why I think ideology is driving the narrative, not sound medical practices and not science. So you know what? You want me to argue against the laws from conservatives? I'm not going to do it if this is what you're saying, because you're not making a real argument. I did a steel man, okay? I said the doctors prescribed James. I can understand that. But this shows me ideology is a major driving factor for why you're even saying these things. So I don't trust you. Stick around. Next segment's coming up at 4 p.m. youtube.com/Timcast. It is a different channel. It is my main flagship. It's going to be political. So if you're into politics, come check it out. I will see you all there.